Korea insinuates that it has labeled the South a hostile state in its revised constitution, prompting strong condemnation from the government in Seoul. Korea's auto exports were up nearly 5% in September from the same month the previous year, reaching $5.5 billion, driven by rising demand for eco-friendly cars. BTS member JHope was discharged from his 18-month mandatory military service today, much to the delight of his fans. It's October 17th, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We start once again here on the peninsula, where North Korea's state media reports that South Korea has been labeled a hostile state by the Kim Jong-un regime. It has also mentioned the inter-Korean roads being destroyed by the regime 2 days ago. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has the latest.
North Korean state media for the first time publicly mentioned that it defined South Korea as a hostile state in the constitution. In a report on the North state-run Korean Central News Agency on Thursday, the regime said it was, quote, an inevitable and legitimate measure stemming from the serious security circumstances mounting to the unpredictable brink of war due to grave political and military provocations of the hostile forces. The regime previously convened a key parliamentary meeting, the Supreme People's Assembly, earlier on October 7th and 8th. It was widely thought that the North could have made constitutional changes defining inter-Korean relations, as Pyongyang had declared its intention to redefine Seoul as a hostile state last year, along with Kim's order to remove references to peaceful unification. But none related to the issue had been disclosed until Thursday's news report. The report did not mention further details, though, other than mentioning how the Constitution defined the South as a hostile state. South Korean Unification Ministry sources called North Korea's move an anti-unification and anti-national action. But it also said there is a small possibility of the regime not having made the actual amendment, as the regime statement used ambiguous words such as in meeting the demand of the Constitution. The ministry also said it needs to monitor whether there were constitutional changes on territory, especially over the possibility of the regime declaring a new maritime border in the constitution. As Kim Jong-un previously said, the regime cannot accept the northern limit line, the de facto maritime border between the two Koreas. Also on Thursday, KCNA reported on the North having detonated the last symbol of inter-Korean reconciliation, the Gyeonggi and Donghae Line roads. It said the explosions carried out by the Korean People's Army have completely blocked parts of the road and railway along the east coast and parts in Kaesong in the west. While saying such a move was to completely separate the sovereign territory of the North and the South, the North's Defense Ministry spokesperson said the regime's actions to permanently fortify its southern border will continue. To this, South Korea's Defense Ministry said it is monitoring if the regime makes any such moves.
We are continuously monitoring and assessing the fortification activities that North Korea claims to be conducting.
Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Against this backdrop, senior diplomats of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan have condemned North Korea's continued violations of UN Security Council resolutions. The condemnation was carried in a joint statement following a meeting here in Seoul earlier on Wednesday among First Vice Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun and his American and Japanese counterpart Kurt Campbell and Masataka Okano, respectively. The three officials also pledged trilateral efforts to tackling military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, as well as illicit cyber activities by the Kim Jong-un regime and his dispatch of North Korean workers overseas for funds to support his hostile weapons ambitions. The talks also addressed the rampant violations of human rights in North Korea, while calling for the release of abductees, detainees, and the prisoners of war. In the meantime, the South Korean government is closely monitoring reports of North Korea sending troops to Russia, following renewed claims by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Our correspondent Kim Jong-sil reports.
South Korea announced Thursday that it is carefully tracking reports of North Korean troop deployments to Russia.
If the reports are true, it means the North is not only trading arms with Russia, but also directly participating in the war. Our government considers this a very serious issue.
The government underscored that such actions would fall under international scrutiny and sanctions, calling once again for a halt to the illicit military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang. The response from the government came as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy repeated his recent claims that North Korea is now sending military personnel to help Russia's war effort, as well as transferring weapons. Experts in South Korea say Pyongyang likely would have sent the troops based on the recent comprehensive strategic partnership treaty between Russia and North Korea that states military coordination in the case of foreign attacks.
I think the claims made by the President of Ukraine is credible. It is likely that Pyongyang will gradually escalate the intensity of its troop deployment to Russia in line with this agreement.
Russia's foreign ministry was quick to dismiss the allegations, calling them irrelevant.
North Korea and Russia, both countries are denying this, but there seems to be rather strong evidence. So recent development suggests that North Korea-Russia relations are morphing into a de facto military alliance.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden is visiting Germany on Thursday to discuss continued support for Ukraine. 김정실, Arirang News.
In Belgium, 4 Indo-Pacific nations, including South Korea, are taking part in the NATO Defense Ministers meeting for the first time. Vice Defense Minister Kim Sun-ho is attending the 2-day gathering in Brussels starting Thursday, with senior officials from 32 nations addressing ways to support Ukraine and to strengthen cooperation with the 4 Indo-Pacific partners, namely South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. This is the first ministerial meeting of the Security Alliance since new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte took office earlier this month. Over in the Middle East, the U.S. has fired multiple airstrikes against the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the military on Wednesday U.S. time conducted precision strikes against 5 underground weapons storage facilities using B-2 stealth bombers. Austin said the Houthis have used the weapons in the storage to target civilian and military vessels throughout the region. The Houthis have also been attacking Israel with missiles in support of Hamas in Gaza. The Foreign Ministry in Seoul has voiced disappointment in response to reports of a ritual offering by Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where Class A war criminals are honored. In a statement on this Thursday, the ministry called on Tokyo to face its history by taking responsible action. According to Japanese media, Ishiba's offering came in celebration of the Shrine's Fall Festival and is his first since entering office at the start of this month. In other news, Korea's auto exports rose almost 5% on year in September, driven by global demand for eco-friendly cars. Our Lee Soo-jin has the details.
South Korea's auto exports reached a new monthly high in September. Data released by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Thursday showed that the value of car exports stood at $5.5 billion, surpassing the previous record of $5.2 billion set in September last year. This is also up 4.9% compared to September the previous year. The cumulative export value from January to September came to $52.9 billion, up 1.6% year-on-year, also record high for that period. The ministry said robust exports were mostly driven by high demand for eco-friendly vehicles and a recovery in outbound shipments from GM Korea, the country's third-largest automaker. The export value of eco-friendly vehicles rose 12.3% year-on-year to nearly $2 billion last month, recording a turnaround for the first time in 4 months. This was led by the value of outbound shipments of hybrid models such as Hyundai Motor Santa Fe and Tucson, as well as Kia's Carnival, surging more than 75%. And the export volume of GM Korea was also up 8.5% and 130% month-on-month, with more than 35,000 vehicles shipped last month. Domestic production levels were also up 1.7% compared to a year earlier, with over 307,000 cars manufactured last month. While there was one less working day compared to September last year, monthly production levels were able to recover to the 300,000 range for the first time in 3 months, thanks to the high overseas demand. And while overall domestic sales fell 2.3% compared to the previous year, the high demand for eco-friendly vehicles was also seen in Korea as well. Sales of hybrid vehicles were especially noteworthy, with 46,000 sold, which is up by around 60% year-on-year, surpassing the previous high of 41,000 in December last year. 이수진, Arirang News.
After years on the watch list, South Korea's government bonds will soon be included in the World Government Bond Index. To delve into what this milestone means for the nation's economy, our finance correspondent Moon Hae-ryun joins us here in the studio. Hae-ryun, first of all, what exactly is the World Government Bond Index?
Well, Changmin, it's a prestigious global index that tracks the performance of high-quality government bonds from developed and emerging countries. If a country's government bonds are included, it can have major economic implications. FTSE Russell announced last week that South Korea would be officially entering the ranks of its benchmark index starting November next year, after being placed on its watch list since 2022. To be included, strict criteria related to market quality, liquidity, and accessibility must be met, and there was speculation that Seoul would only be given the green light next year. The inclusion was therefore reported to be something of a surprise, but a number of reforms to increase accessibility to foreign investors tick the boxes needed for the FTSE to make its decision. South Korea already met the requirements for market size, but it extended its foreign exchange trading hours and simplified procedures for foreign investors earlier this year.
So, Hae-ryun, being listed on the index could have major economic implications. What are they?
So the government and analysts are anticipating a number of different economic benefits, but there are 3 that are being seen as particularly important. Following the announcement, President Yoon Suk-yeol spoke of the first, inflow of foreign capital.
이번 세계 국제 지수 편입으로 약 75조 원의 글로벌 투자 자금이 유입될 것으로 전망됩니다.
75 trillion won, around $55 billion isn't just a random number. It's been calculated by taking South Korea's 2.2% portion of the index that is linked with roughly $2.5 trillion of total capital. As the index is closely watched by major institutional investors, once a country's bonds are included, these funds are likely to buy them to ensure their portfolios match the index. And this influx of global investment is also expected to affect interest rates.
Interest rates are expected to stabilize, reducing funding costs for people and businesses.
Higher demand for bonds lowers yields as investors accept lower returns for stability. According to the Korea Institute of Finance, the inclusion in the WGBI is expected to lower government bond interest rates by about 0.2 to 0.6 percentage points through the influx of government bond funds. This has a trickle-down effect for corporate bonds too. As government bond yields fall, corporate bonds become more attractive, which in turn reduces funding costs for companies. Analysts also predict that greater stability in the foreign exchange market would come about.
Korean currency markets, the won exchange rate tend to be volatile in part because the Korean won-dollar market is so small.
This means that any large transactions can make the market volatile, so a larger market with more debt could stabilize the won's exchange rates. For example, research from the Korea Capital Market Institute has shown that countries included in the WGBI experienced a definite currency appreciation against the dollar.
Going forward, are there any other steps that South Korea needs to take before it officially joins the index?
So, Changmin, there were expectations that the FTSE Russell would continue to keep South Korea on its watch list for the year due to the government's short-selling ban. So, short-selling or shorting is when investors trade with borrowed shares, and they do this in the hope that prices will fall later, so they can buy them back at a lower price and pocket the difference. The government placed a market-wide ban on short selling last November as it prepared to develop a system to control illicit trading practices after the financial watchdog imposed record-high fines on 2 international investment banks. Initially, the ban was due to be lifted in June, but it was extended until March next year to test and establish an electronic system to prevent naked short selling. President Yoon pledged to further elevate South Korea's capital markets through the Corporate Value Up program, which aims to eliminate the so-called Korea discount and undervaluing of South Korean stocks.
Right, it's an important issue. Thank you, Hye-yeon, for the report today.
Thank you for having me.
On the political front, the results of Wednesday's by-elections are out, with both the ruling and main opposition parties winning in their strongholds. Our correspondent Lee Si-hoo has more.
As expected, the results of Wednesday's by-elections for an education superintendent and heads of local governments followed the country's regional political divides. In what was the first voting since April's general election, the ruling People Power Party won 2 seats, one of which was in the traditionally conservative city of Busan, while the main opposition Democratic Party won 2 seats in the traditionally liberal province of Jeollanam-do, and the Liberal Bloc won in Seoul. The PPP's Yoon Il-hyun won in Kimjeong-gu district in Busan, and Park Yong-chol won in Gangwon County in the city of Incheon. The DP won in 2 counties in Jeollanam-do province, Jangse-il in Yeonggwang-gun and Joseong-rae in Gokseong-gun counties. The Liberal superintendent candidate Chung Keun-sik took the majority in the capital. The final turnout for Seoul was 23.5%, while for the 4 districts and counties combined, it was 53.9%. In these by-elections, the strength and ability of the rival parties' new leaderships were put to the test. During the campaigns, PPP chairman Han Dong-un and DP chairman Lee Jae-myung put in special efforts to support their respective candidates, traveling often to the contested areas. With both parties safely securing seats in the expected regions, Han and Lee both remarked they will move forward with the support people have given them. Han said the people have given the PPP and the government a chance to change and renovate, and so that they will work hard to achieve such change, while Lee said they will respect the public sentiment and prevent the government from moving backward, and also lead in safeguarding the lives of the people. The election winners will take their post immediately and serve the remainder of the term through June 2026. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
The former commissioner of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency, Kim Kwang-ho, was found not guilty of negligence in his handling of the Itaewon disaster, which happened 2 years ago. The Seoul Western District Court ruled on Thursday that negligence by Kim in performing his duties was not proven. The court explained it was unlikely Kim could have specifically predicted the disaster and that a direct link between his actions and the tragedy was unclear. 2 other officials who were on duty the day of the disaster and accused of the same charge were also found not guilty. However, about 3 weeks ago, former chief of Yongsan Police Station in Seoul, Lee Im-jae, was found guilty of negligence. On the K-pop front, JHope was discharged from his 18-month military duty earlier today, becoming the second BTS member to reunite with the group's fans. Lee Eun-hee tells us more.
JHope is back. The main dancer of global K-pop sensation BTS has now completed his 18-month mandatory military service and was discharged on Thursday morning.
Thank you so much.
I come back in good health, and I'm truly grateful. I couldn't have completed my military service well without the support of all of you, my fans.
He is now the second of the 7 members to reunite with the band's devoted fans, the so-called ARMY. Fans weren't the only ones eagerly awaiting JHope being discharged. Fellow BTS member Jin, dressed in a red suit, was also there to welcome him back. Jin was the first to complete his military service, finishing in June. All 7 are set to reunite in June 2025, after they've all completed their military service. There were no special events as the group's agency Big Hit Music had asked fans to refrain from visiting the site for safety reasons. However, in the afternoon, JHope went live on Weverse, a fan community platform, to express his excitement about starting Chapter 3 of his life, thanking fans for their support during his service. Regarding his future plans, he promised to provide further updates once the details are finalized. The superstar, who took a break as Sergeant Jung Ho-seok, is now ready to take off the beret and uniform and step back into the spotlight as BTS's JHope. 이은희, Arirang News.
During the day, the warm autumn sun shined and the temperatures rose up to 26 degrees in Seoul today. However, the weather will get chilly as it rains. The daytime temperature in Seoul tomorrow will be 20 degrees, 6 degrees lower than today. Rain will start in Jeju tonight and will gradually expand to the southern parts of the country tomorrow morning and the central parts of the country in the afternoon. This rain will continue until Saturday. The expected amount of rainfall will be up to 100 millimeters on the east coast of Gangwon-do province, up to 80 on the other central and southern coastal areas, and up to 60 in the southern parts of the country. Tomorrow morning, Seoul, Daejeon, and Daegu will start off at 16 degrees. Highs will move up to 19 in Chuncheon, Gwangju and Gyeongju 24 degrees. On Sunday, as the temperature drops to the single digits in the morning in Seoul, the coldest weather this fall is expected. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
진짜 한국에선 어떻게 먹는지 알려줄까?
K-바비큐? 신김치랑 먹어야지.
치킨? 치맥 페스티벌은 처음이지?
김치? 종류만큼 먹는 법도 가지각색.
김밥? 시장에선, 산에선, 바다에선 이렇게.
국밥? 취향 따라, 입맛 따라.
이런 한국, 와보지 않고는 모를걸? 요즘 한국에선 어떻게 노는지 알려줄까?
한국에선 아이돌이 되어볼 수도, 인생 거절을 찾을 수도 있지.
제일 핫한 포토 스팟은 여기.
한국은 분명 너에게 새로운 영감을 줄 거야.
이런 한국, 와보지 않고는 모를걸?
The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2024 is awarded to South Korean author Han Kang for her intense poetic prose that confronts historical traumas and exposes the fragility of human life.
저는 이제 책을 너무 재밌게 봤는데 그래서 더 뭔가 저희와 해소돼서 알고 싶다라는 생각을 했고
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve into the most up-to-date stories across the globe. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Amid rising conflicts across many parts of the world, the two-day NATO defense ministers meeting kicked off in Brussels on Thursday. Defense chiefs from 32 member states are to discuss ways to strengthen deterrence, support war-stricken Ukraine, and foster cooperation with global partners. The latest event will be a special occasion, especially for South Korea, as the so-called IP4 nations, South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, have been invited to join for the very first time. So what are the major points of discussion and what would be South Korea's biggest takeaway? For answers to this, we are joined by Robert Kelly, Professor for International Relations at Busan National University. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also joining us will be Kim Young-jun, Professor of National Security College at the Korean National Defense University. Great to have you, Professor, too.
Thank you. Hello from Tokyo.
So, Professor Kelly, the official outcomes are yet to be released, but what could be the key agenda items for this meeting?
Well, I think it's almost certainly going to be dominated by Ukraine, right? The Ukraine war has gone on a lot longer, really, I think, than anybody anticipated, certainly more than the Russians anticipated. One of the arguments Donald Trump has used to power his campaign is that he can finally bring this thing to an end, which seems to be the consensus in the West. Everybody seems to want to get around this because they're worried about nuclear escalation and things like that. So I'd imagine, to the extent that this is mostly a NATO event, of course, right, but for the IP4, that a lot of the focus will be on the Ukraine war. And as you said in your intro, right, I mean, how can we support Ukraine? A lot of the Eastern European states in NATO continue to really want to support Ukraine. They want some kind of, if not full victory, they want to at least push the Russians out of what's been occupied since 2022. And so I think there'll be a big discussion inside NATO, probably, I'm sort of speculating here, but probably between the defense ministers of East and West within Europe, right, about how much exactly we should be supporting the Ukrainians. And then to the extent that the Asian ministers are coming too, right, that's sort of new, as you mentioned, right, and then I think there will be pressure on them, right? Are you going to be part of this? Do you want to help or not, right? We know that South Korea, for example, has sort of transshipped shells through the United States to support the Ukrainians, particularly last year in the offensive. And there will be, I think, a fair amount of jockeying to see what the Asian allies, these sort of semi-NATO partners now, what they think about the Ukraine war. Do they want to continue to support Ukraine? You know, does Japan and Korea want the war to end, or they think that Ukraine should push for some kind of victory, right? I think that's probably what it will dominate it. You know, there'll be larger sort of questions too, terrorism and the war in the Middle East and things like that, but I think the overwhelming focus will be on the war in Ukraine.
Right, largely on the war in Ukraine. But before we get into the details, as you've mentioned, for the first time, the so-called IP4 has been invited to the meeting. Professor Kim, what significance and context does this invitation hold?
Yes, NATO always welcome IP4 country and is want to have some support from Indo-Pacific country for the Russian-Ukraine war. At the same time, NATO really want to have some kind of an important role, especially in the Pacific area against China, the one of the strongest challenge against NATO. So in this context, so-called IP4, South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand is a very important partner for NATO. At the same time, NATO want to share a value alliance with this partner. So this is a great partnership between the NATO and IP4, not just in the Atlantic or separately in the Pacific region, but at the same time, they share value in saving international liberal order against the strongest challenge like Russia, China, and North Korea. So this is a very important partnership, but at the same time, they just don't want to have a slogan. They just want to have to work together in more detail. So this defense minister meeting is a very important turning point, not just slogan, but they want to have some detailed job together.
Right. So in this wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Professor Kelly, what is the current state of relations between Russia and North Korea, as well as Russia-China alliance? How is the tight-knit relationship between the three perceived internationally?
Yeah, so the question of what exactly the Russians are giving the North Koreans and vice versa, right? That's a topic for enormous speculation, right? There's a lot of concern that the Russians, who are desperate for ammunition, are going to give the Russians some kind of re-entry technology for its missiles, or guidance technology or something like that, right? Or miniaturization technology. You know, we know the North Koreans have an ICBM. We know the North Koreans need to lighten it. They need to build smaller payloads to put on top of those, strike the United States. The Russians have that kind of technology. There's a lot of anxiety about that. Right? Of course, we don't know, right? Because obviously the Russians and the North Koreans aren't going to tell us this kind of stuff. But certainly the relationship is closer than it's been in a while. The Russians are now facilitating the full violation of UN sanctions, right? They sank the expert committee on the sanctions oversight earlier this year. Presumably Russian banks, which are being closed out of Western operations, are going to be wide open for the North Koreans to sort of do their various corruption and elite money schemes and whatnot through them, right? And so, I think the Russians and North Koreans, if only because they're both pariahs, will be a lot closer in the future, right? I mean, Russia will not be normalized as long as Putin is still president. So I think the Russian-North Korea relationship has a while to go, probably at least a decade. I think the larger question you brought up was a really good one, though, right? Which is, to what extent are Russia, China, and North Korea, and perhaps Iran cooperating now with some kind of alliance or some kind of group, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk now about an alliance of authoritarianism or an axis of authoritarianism, right? People remember the axis from the 30s and 40s, and they think, is this sort of the same thing? It's tough to know, right? Because we just don't know to what extent they're variously supporting one another. There are rumors of North Korean soldiers going to fight in Russia against the Ukrainians. That would be a big step forward to this group becoming more than just like a gang and actually becoming some kind of alliance. I think the real core marker to watch for that, though, is not Russia, North Korea, and Iran, all of whom are pariahs, all of whom are isolated and reckless, right? It's really China. Because if China really gets behind the revisionist efforts of the Russians and the North Koreans and so on, the Chinese have the most to lose, because they're the most heavily integrated into the world system, right? They benefit substantially from their participation in the WTO. They benefit substantially from their access to Western markets. And if the Chinese really throw their weight behind North Korea and Russia and Iran to a certain extent, perhaps in the conflict in the Middle East, that will really, really accelerate the decoupling that's already begun between China and many of its trade partners, right? So I think China is the one to watch of those four rogue states.
Right, so we'll have to keep close eyes on China's next moves. Now, going back to the IP4, the IP4 has been invited to NATO summit and foreign ministers' meetings for 3 consecutive years. Could this suggest that the IP4 is effectively securing a quasi-member status within NATO, Professor Kelly?
Yes, Professor Kelly already pointed out the IP4 country members of the NATO. So this is a significant point for the IP4 country as a quasi-member status with the NATO. And at the same time, this is very important for NATO and at the same time for IP4, because Russia and Ukraine are showing the Russia and Ukraine not just impact on the European theater, but global issue. And at the same time, a Taiwan contingency scenario is a kind of the red line in saving liberal international order, not just a regional issue, not just in the Pacific issue. So NATO is really want to have a role kind of against possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and IP4 is a very important partner against that. So this is not just a regional partnership in Europe for NATO and in the Pacific for the IP4. This is the global the membership as a value alliance in saving liberal democracy, human rights against the dictatorship country like China, Russia, North Korea. So yes, my answer is IP4 already quasi-member status within NATO.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Professor Kelly? Do you agree that IP4 has become a bigger influence to NATO?
Yeah, definitely, right? I think that NATO has been sort of looking increasingly towards China because the Chinese are providing a lot of assistance to the Russians in the war, right? We know that China has provided a lot of financial assistance and maybe providing dual-use assistance. Again, we don't really know because obviously the Russians and the Chinese are going to tell us this stuff, but there's a great deal of suspicion out there, and there's some data to support that, right? We know that the Russian ruble, for example, has not collapsed, which is almost certainly because of economic support out of the Chinese. And to the extent that Russia or China is providing the lifeblood of these various challengers, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, right? China is increasingly the focus, right, of liberal democracies everywhere, right? I mean, ultimately, NATO is just an organization. What really matters, as Dr. Kim said, right, is that we all sort of share the same basic values, right? I mean, whether you're Australia or Italy or Korea or whatever, right? And we're all basically liberal democracies concerned about these authoritarian states on the move. And to the extent that Russia and China are coordinating, you're going to see the democracies coordinate more. I mean, the Biden people, if I recall, the Biden people originally 4 or 5 years ago were talking about we're going to have like an alliance of democracies. That kind of didn't really work. But if the IP4 starts to show up at NATO on a regular basis, you're basically getting the same thing, right? And I would imagine that there are probably efforts to reach out to democracies in Latin America and elsewhere to try to create a sort of larger network because, it looks like China is funding this sort of big challenge, and that's going to provoke a response, which is what this is.
Mm-hmm. With that being said, Professor Kim, during the meeting, what kind of practical areas of cooperation do you anticipate NATO to discuss, particularly with IP4?
Yes, I have been working with the Minister of National Defense now. The Vice Minister of MMD participating in the NATO defense meeting. And many issues like defense industry collaboration or expanded military training are example for the discussing issue between the NATO and the IP4 because, for example, South Korea is one of the top countries to export defense industry, and also Australia and Japan is one of the advanced country to having like AI or the other technology power. And also at the same time, NATO really want to expand the joint military training in the Pacific area, so they need a partnership, and the US lead NATO and also IP4 need for the having combined military exercise against the South China Sea issue or Taiwan contingency issue, even North Korea issue. So many issues like this kind of defense industry collaboration between NATO, IP4, and expanded military training are important area for discussion.
Right. So we have been emphasizing the role of China as we held our discussion. In its 2022 new strategic concept, NATO identified China as a threat for the very first time. Professor, what role might South Korea play in NATO's efforts to counter China? If military cooperation would be on the table, what kind of impact do you think this would have on Seoul's relationship with Beijing, Professor Kim?
Yes, this is a kind of dilemma for South Korea. We have to have a good relation with the NATO and commitment to Russian-Ukraine war. At the same time, we have to manage the relation between China and South Korea because China is an important trading partner, and we need any Chinese support for solving North Korean issue. So this is a very difficult dilemma for South Korea. But anyway, we can do that. We can have a both good relation with the NATO and China because NATO partnership not just about the China or Taiwan contingency, but it's about Russian-Ukraine war or North Korean military threat, or at the same time in saving the international order, rule-based order. So we can try to having a NATO partnership. At the same time, we have to manage the relation with China as one of the largest trading partner.
What about you, Professor Kelly? How can South Korea balance its commitments to NATO with its relationship with China and North Korea, especially in light of the current geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, that's like the big question for South Korean grand strategy for the next 20 years. So we could be here all night, right? I mean, South Korea has been trying to figure out a way to walk between the raindrops between the U.S. and China, between authoritarian states and democratic states for a while, right? A lot of that is just because of South Korea's unfortunate geography. You live next to three autocracies. I mean, you have to find a way to live with North Korea, Russia, and China because they're on your doorstep. And of course, as Dr. Kim mentioned, also, China is now a big trading partner for South Korea. And I think ultimately what the South Korean government's going to have to do is I don't think there are any big immediate steps. I think instead the South Korean government's going to have to sort of go through a big debate about what exactly to do, build some kind of consensus, at least between right and left, between the two big parties in Korea, about how to respond to this. So the Yoon government, for example, has begun to emphasize decoupling from China. It has encouraged South Korean businesses to go elsewhere, and the United States has now resumed its position as South Korea's #1 export target. It was China, I think, for about 15 years and became the U.S. just again last year. It's that kind of stuff. It's going to take a while. I think there will also be discussion and interest in whether or not South Korea's defense industrial base, which was mentioned is pretty big, right, can help provide support for Ukraine again in the future, right, or can provide, sort of cheaper munitions and weapons in Southeast Asia, right, because of the Chinese pressure on the South China Sea. So I think there's some things that South Korea can do, but it's going to have to manage this deftly with China, although I will say I don't think in the long term South Korea is going to be able to do both. You can think of it as like a Venn diagram, and the ice between, with South Korea living on the space between the U.S. and China. I think eventually that's going to dissipate, unless Xi Jinping. My sense is that Xi Jinping is pretty belligerent now about what China's foreign policy goals are in regarding Taiwan and Southeast Asia, and at some point he's going to push. He's 71, which means his mortality is an issue. I would imagine there will be some kind of Chinese move in Southeast Asia in the next 10 to 15 years. And South Korea, like a lot of other countries, Australia, the Philippines, and so on, is going to have to make a choice. I think South Korea's done a good job of putting that choice off, right? And that's wise to do. But I think that choice is ultimately unavoidable. And one of the things I argue a lot at conferences in South Korea is that South Korea should start laying the groundwork by having a big debate about this now. Like, what are you guys going to do if there's a conflict over Taiwan? Like, I don't know, right? I'm not really sure South Korea really knows. And I think that's what needs to happen, is there just needs to be a big discussion about, like, what do we want to do? How far do we want to go? If the Americans fight this thing, do we want to join them 100% or maybe only 50% because we don't want to participate in what could become a nuclear war? I don't really know what the right answer is, but I think there's a lot of grand strategy thinking that needs to be done in South Korea, and a lot of it will be done behind closed doors, not to provoke China, but some of it's got to be done in public, because South Korea is a democracy, and the South Korean public has to be ready for this choice. It can't just happen like the Cuban Missile Crisis or something. There needs to be, I would argue, there should be some kind of public discussion of, like, what do you do in this awkward position you're in between, you know, the dictatorships and the democracies.
Right, so we will have to make a decision at some point.
I think so.
Yes, and at the suggestion of Australia, there will also be a separate meeting among IP4 nations. And this marks a significant occasion, as it will be the first time these 4 countries meet without other NATO members. Professor Kelly, what does Australia want, and what are they likely to discuss?
Yeah, so I actually think it's great that the East Asian defense ministers are meeting, right? I mean, it's too bad you can't have the Filipinos and others in there too, right? I mean, there are a lot of other states worried about China, not just the 4 that are showing up. But I would imagine, I mean, these are the most robust democracies in China's sort of maritime perimeter, and I think that's why they were invited. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on freedom of operation, freedom of navigation in South China Sea. That's obvious, right? A lot of these, you know, Japan and South Korea get their oil from the Persian Gulf through the South China Sea, so free transit there is an issue, right? We know that the Australians and the New Zealanders have participated in transit near Taiwan. That's probably the other big issue, right? Most of the security strategic issues are maritime, so I'd imagine that there's focus there. But also, I would imagine a lot of it is just trying to sort of put the groundwork together for these 4 to talk to each other. It's not really clear to me that Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia have any kind of like running, standing operation, right, where they're regularly communicating with each other about issues of importance like missile defense. So I would imagine that a lot of what it is just sort of saying, should we do this again? Like, what would it look like? Should we have some kind of like sub-ministerial meeting or something like that? Should we be sharing intelligence data or satellite data? I would imagine a lot of that basic groundwork just doesn't exist, and so there will be a lot of that to start with.
Right, so more discussions will be coming.
Yeah, always talking.
Now, as Professor Kelly mentioned a while ago, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has emphasized prioritizing support for Ukraine is one of the major topics. He could ask for support from partner nations like Seoul. And given that South Korea has not provided lethal aid to Ukraine, Professor Kim, do you think there could be changes to South Korea's decision?
In conclusion, first, no big change. And I know Zelenskyy made the argument the North Korean soldier found in the Ukraine war, surprisingly, and this is not right thing. And some media news, Putin really want to have a 3,000 North Korean soldier unit or something like that. And NATO Secretary General also emphasized that this is not a good thing. But yeah. South Korea are really concerned about this, and nobody expected North Korean soldier participating actually in the war zone. But this will be not a big change for South Korean position in sending little aid or something like that, because everybody wants to stop the war, but at the same time, the U.S. presidency election is coming just 3 weeks away, and we need to wait some who will be the U.S. leader and how the Russian-Ukraine war will going after this November. So will really support Ukraine. At the same time, North Korean soldier funding is a terrible, terrible issue. But at the same time, South Korean position will be no big change at the moment, and we need to have some type of a new leadership of the White House, and we will collaborate lately, continue after this November.
Right, so no dramatic change in South Korea's point. Meanwhile, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is advocating for an Asian version of NATO. Professor Kim, what is the feasibility of this initiative, and what does Ishiba want to pursue through this?
Yeah, now everybody talk about Prime Minister Ishiba's the vision on NATO. So many Japanese colleagues of mine and maybe Professor Kelly's friend in Japan maybe share this will be not easy for making NATO in the Pacific area. But anyway, the Prime Minister Ishiba that suggests this issue, and he didn't mention how many countries during this. Maybe 3 countries will be possible for NATO. But NATO membership is all about the automatic the intervention when somebody is invaded by other countries. So this is not easy. But anyway, Prime Minister Ishiba seriously suggested this vision when he became the Prime Minister. So maybe after this election in Japan, maybe we can talk about it. And we need anyway a U.S. partnership for this one. So maybe this will be, looks like very difficult issue, and many people oppose it. But we need to open anything that for that making NATO in Asia or something like that. So we don't know yet, but this is very interesting, and in some way this is a good idea against a challenge like China, Russia, and North Korea in this region.
All right. I'm afraid we will have to conclude our discussion at this point, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your insights and your time tonight. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very much.
Now that wraps up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Korea time. Until then, goodbye.